Hi, and welcome to the New Zealand Veterinary Association webinar series, Disbudding and Dehorning of Cattle. My name is Ash Kewen, and I'm the Veterinary Manager for Large Animals here at the NZVA in Wellington. I'm going to be hosting this four-part webinar series, which is designed to assist veterinarians to help their farming clients fulfil their obligations under the new regulations for disbudding and dehorning of cattle. There are four presentations in this series, which are titled Animal Welfare Care and Procedures Regulations 2018, NZVA Resources, Authorisation of Local Anaesthetic, and Training Non-Veterinarians. In this first presentation, we will talk through the development of the new regulations, the key wording of these regulations, and what options are available to veterinarians as they support their clients to comply with the disbudding and dehorning regulations. Prior to the regulations, New Zealand had two main instruments for promoting good animal welfare standards. These are codes of welfare, which are specific, detailed, and are based on animal welfare science and accepted good practice. However, codes of welfare are not directly enforceable. And then there's the Animal Welfare Act 1999, which in contrast is very high level, and it outlines the general obligations that people have to meet the physical and behavioural needs of animals. Offences successfully prosecuted under the Animal Welfare Act are typically serious. So it was identified that there needed to be some middle ground where less severe offences could be directly enforced without the need for a protracted legal process. So in 2015, the Animal Welfare Act was amended, and that allowed for the creation of regulations. And these bridge the gap between the two existing pillars of animal welfare in New Zealand. The Animal Welfare Care and Procedures regulations were introduced in 2018, and most of the regulations were in effect from the 1st of October in 2018. However, the regulations 57 and 58, which pertain to disbudding and dehorning of cattle, were delayed until the 1st of October in 2019, and that was to allow industry, including veterinarians, time to prepare for these changes. There are two levels of penalty for offences under the regulations. The first are infringement offences, which result in a fine but not a criminal conviction. And then there are prosecutable offences, which may result in a criminal conviction and a court-imposed fine. It's worth noting that disbudding and dehorning of cattle are both prosecutable offences under the regulations, and that serious offences are still able to be prosecuted under the Animal Welfare Act 1999. We'll now look a little bit closer at the wording of the regulations 57 disbudding and 58 dehorning, and there are several points that are worth noting. Firstly, that the obligation to comply rests with the owner of the animals as well as every person in charge. And this is an acknowledgement that all people have an obligation to protect the welfare of animals being disbudded and dehorned, even if those animals don't belong to them. Regarding anaesthesia, a cattle beast must not be disbudded or dehorned unless, throughout the procedure, it is under the influence of an appropriately placed and effective local anaesthetic. This means it's not enough to simply administer local anaesthetic. The user should be trained to place it correctly, which may include a ring block depending on the size of the animal. And the user should also be trained to assess the efficacy of the anaesthetic and respond in the appropriate way if the efficacy is marginal or insufficient. It's worth noting here that caustic paste is unlikely to comply with the regulations, as the duration of action of caustic paste is likely to exceed the duration of action of the local anaesthetic, and that would violate the requirement for local anaesthetic throughout the procedure. Now, the local anaesthetic is to be authorised by a veterinarian for the purpose of the procedure. Any authorisation of local anaesthetic is done for a specific procedure, and in this case that would be disbudding or dehorning, and those procedures are not interchangeable. If local anaesthetic is being used for a procedure outside what has been specifically authorised for, that is grounds to terminate the authorisation, and that should be referred to MPI compliance if required. Regarding skills, while administration of local anaesthetic requires specific skills, consideration should be given to the other skills required under the legislation, which are Experience or training in the correct method of being used. This should include the method of local anaesthetic, which could be a nerve block or a ring block, as well as the method of the disbudding or dehorning itself, which could be cautery or scoop, for example. It's worth noting that the regulation does not specify which methods are acceptable, so veterinarians are expected to exercise their discretion in determining what methods would be appropriate for non-veterinarians to use. Further skills are required to enable early recognition of distress, injury, and ill health, and an ability to judge when intervention is required, and that's in the form of remedial action or advice. This is extended to include attention to animal health and welfare during the recovery phase. While veterinarians are not explicitly required to provide training for skills beyond those related to the use of the anaesthetic itself, outcomes are likely to be better for the animal's health and welfare if veterinarians are willing to facilitate access to this training. Veterinarians have 3 options to consider when they are assisting their farming clients to comply. Those are: veterinary staff may perform the procedure, and it's recommended that your practice develop a standard operating procedure for all methods of horn removal and that training of all staff is documented. The NZVA policy and Disbudding SOP may provide some general guidance to practices in development of their own processes. Veterinarians may authorise local anaesthetic for disbudding or dehorning via veterinary authorisation. Most of you will be familiar with this process through authorisation of other RVNs such as antibiotics and anti-inflammatories. Veterinary authorisations are legally enforceable under the ACVM Act and are required to contain essential information. You've also got professional obligations pertaining to veterinary authorisation, which are regulated by the Veterinary Council of New Zealand under the Code of Professional Conduct, so it's worth being aware of what those obligations are. The NZVA Local Anaesthetic Authorisation Guideline does contain information on the veterinary authorisation process, including a template that you can use to capture the required information within your authorisation. And the third option is that veterinarians may authorise local anaesthetic for disbudding or dehorning via veterinary operating instructions or VOI. Some of you will be familiar with the VOI process, while others will have never issued a VOI. As with any veterinary authorisation, a VOI must contain certain information, which again is enforceable under the ACVM Act, and there are professional obligations pertaining to VOI, which again are regulated by the Veterinary Council of New Zealand under the Code of Professional Conduct. The NZVA Local Anaesthetic Authorisation Guideline does contain information on the VOI process as well, including a template which you can use to capture that required information within your VOI. This here is an excerpt from the NZVA resources which shows an overview of these 3 options. And you can learn more about these NZVA resources in the second webinar of this series. So that concludes the first webinar in the series on disbudding and dehorning of cattle. We've discussed the development of the regulations, the key wording within the regulations, and the options veterinarians have when assisting their farming clients to comply with these regulations. In the next webinar, we will become more familiar with the NZVA resources which relate to disbudding and dehorning of cattle. If you've got questions or feedback regarding this webinar series, disbudding or dehorning generally, or any other matters, feel free to get in touch with us via email or phone. So thanks for joining me, and we'll see you next time.